Welcome. We're back. This is episode 133 of the Survivor's Guide to Life podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And last time we were with you, Peter had just returned from a trip to Florida to see his mom, and we are back into our regular routine. Another thing that we're back to today is an article that we found late February that we were very impressed and touched by, and we as we do around here, every so often something that we loved surfaces again, and we say, wasn't this an important article? And this one was from the New York Times. The title is "We Must Learn to Look at Grief Even When We Want to Run Away." The author is Sunita Puri. She is a palliative care doctor.
I always think the palliative care doctors that we know are all hospice doctors.
They often are part of the hospice system.
Yeah, and the doctors we know are more along the line. They're a different breed.
It's a different approach. It's not the approach of curing extraordinary measures. It's the acceptance that quality of life toward the end of life matters in the decisions people make about treatment.
Yeah, yes. And it was such a relief to me to meet palliative care doctors after the real clinical work I know that we were immersed in and taking care of my wife and taking care of others, where they're trying to do anything they can medically and scientifically to find answers. And what we really have seen with the real, much more serious sicknesses, like Lynn had terminal diseases, and after what we've seen over the last 2 years or so with the pandemic, is that there aren't always scientific or clinical answers.
No.
And that instead you have to bear witness with families and loved ones and people going through this in a different way, because you're not going to have answers. You're not going to have cures for them. I remember at one point we had to walk away from it. We looked at it and saw it was actually doing more harm than good.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've seen that many more times since then.
One classic way that we saw that was that each time we would take Lynn to the emergency room, she would be depleted and come home not able to recover to the same place as before. And when we were then working with hospice, they mentioned this, that going to the emergency room is an extreme experience for people near the end of life and should be avoided if possible.
Yeah, we learned a lot. It was along the lines of what we were experiencing. It was along the lines of what we've known intuitively and with our own experiences as a trauma, helping people with trauma and families with trauma. So it was it fit, but we were immersed, and these are very personal journeys. So we learned an awful lot. What we've also learned is we weren't alone. There's plenty of people that know what we do and more, and see it the same way that we do.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things we have run into, and I've spoken about it so many times, is when your loved ones or you're helping others that are dealing with terminal illnesses and sickness, traumatic sickness, it is so frightening and overwhelming. And it creates a grief reaction. There's different kinds of grief reactions, even when the person's still alive.
Yes.
What's that?
Ambiguous
loss.
Ambiguous grief.
And we've learned so much about that since then. And it's also very intense grief. So it's not less. It's very intense. But what we've also seen is people's different reactions to facing mortality.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a subject that people approach lightly. And especially in our society, we've talked about this before, how our society has been set up with so much distraction from not even going near the issue of mortality until the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then we had a collective bombardment of trauma and grief and loss that has been enormous. Well, we've lost over 1 million people to it. Mm-hmm. Last week I found out that my own mechanic, he almost died. He was on a respirator for a month.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't know that. And he talked about it. He talked about what he went through and what it was like.
He's a young man.
He's young.
Relatively young man.
Yeah, he's in his 30s.
Yeah.
but he almost died. They didn't think he was going to live, and he was on the respirator itself for over a month. But he spoke to me, and I listened, and we at this point have such a familiarity with the experience that it was easy to listen to. It was easy to be there and relate to him as a fellow traveler and a fellow human being. We've seen reactions to these experiences. Two very pronounced ones. There are those, and I want to say such as myself. Okay, I get to use myself that instead of running away from it, really look at it as an opportunity to be there for the person, be very involved, do whatever I can, no matter how critical and how much of a crisis it is, and to really look and examine so much of what goes on when I'm involved, and when things are going on. And it's a tough road. But I've also seen many others that don't want to look and they run away. And I can't say I've had a whole lot of understanding or compassion for people who do that. But over a period of time, I think I've softened. It's not that I think it's the best way to run away. I don't. I think it's also very human. I would, when we read this paper by Sunita Puri, she speaks about her tendency was to want to run away too.
Yeah, she even made a little bit of a joke of it. She said when she was beginning her practice and she was confronted with such painful experiences, she would indulge in chocolate cake and Saturday Night Live.
Oh, I don't do Saturday Night Live, but I love chocolate. But anyway, what she was talking about, I guess everybody has to face that kind of get that confrontation. I can't even remember in my life when that happened. It had to be so early in my life because I was a survivor of a pretty rough upbringing. But I'll tell you the truth. When she speaks about it, she made the transformation and transition. Excuse me. To stay and to face what was going on and to be there for people in there when they needed it.
She said, eventually I realized it wasn't my job to protect people from their grief or to solve it. I've learned to look when I want to look away.
Right. And that attitude, she had conventional medical training, obviously, because it was to solve the problem and to intervene.
Yeah, it's a more traditional role.
Absolutely. And I remember when we faced that ourselves and realized that is the acceptable and required. That's a standard for the medical profession.
Right. Until
you go over to palliative care, and then you go into a whole new world.
Right.
And she obviously went from one to the other because she's so beautiful. She writes so beautifully. She talks about something too, and she talks about bearing witness to being there and bearing witness to very difficult conditions, seeing things that are very difficult. And she talks about bearing witness as being a prelude to compassion. And I love this. This lady writes beautifully.
She is so eloquent about that.
She is. And the truth is, it's something that we firmly believe in and that we know is true. And we try to convince people who are runners to not run away. And if they're running away, it may be something that they feel frightened of, and they say, well, I feel compassion inside. I don't believe it. I think that you got to hang in there.
Yeah.
And really face it to find the compassion.
Yeah.
And it's much harder. And yet it's so much more meaningful because you get a chance to really examine what's going on in life instead of burying it or compartmentalizing it. And you grow so much through the experience. And then you can discover a purpose within yourself and a strength that you didn't even know you had. We've been talking about this for years.
We have.
I want to talk about a minute. Just very quickly, last time, we have a new nonprofit, a part of our nonprofit called Lynn's Legacy, Caring for the Caregiver. We have had our first board meeting 2 weeks ago. A great group of people, very, very involved in
the community.
Yeah.
In efforts that relate to ours very, very closely.
Really. And some of them we're now associated with one of them, Amy, dealing with homeless and finding homeless.
Share Sonoma, Amy Appleton.
There's a number of people, and they're all Elise,
Mm-hmm.
highly qualified, highly involved.
Services.
And they really give of themselves. So we're very fortunate. But we're dealing with a cause now that's growing exponentially. And there's a collective consciousness that's growing about facing mortality. And these people in our board, and we and many others, have been facing mortality day and night in our work for a long time. Right. And all of these folks and they have been in their own work too.
In their way too.
So now we have a beautiful group of board members for our new nonprofit, and this all developed out of our own grief and our own facing what my wife was going through, and putting together teams of caregivers and being involved with others going through terribly difficult times, really dealing with ultimately our mortality. It's very difficult. Nobody's saying it. It's not, the grief itself isn't over. It's just, it's kind of like moving through it, going on with life, but it doesn't mean that the grief has been compartmentalized or put away. It doesn't mean that at all. It means finding there is more life, your grief is with you, and you can live with it, and finding new ways to live on, move on, but it doesn't mean it's over. No. It just means that you can go forward. You don't have to bury it. You don't have to.
That's something she also said that I thought she did well with. She said that I don't believe in, she puts quotes around it, I don't believe in moving on and finding closure. This language distills the messy complexity of grief into tidy sound bites and asks people to leave something behind, bury it or lock it away.
No.
And that's not the way, that's not what we're talking about.
No, at all. No. She said instead we move forward with grief. Can we do it? And I can attest that we actually can. Mm-hmm. Can we find a way to integrate it and loss into our life to carry it with us? I can attest to it personally. That's exactly what you wind up doing.
Right.
And we're not talking about easy. We're talking about real life. She's talking about something, a profound kind of awareness and change. Obviously, she isn't one of those people that have buried or compartmentalized these. She stood and faced it. She's beared witness to it. Yeah. She's listened to people in their times of need, and she's been there for them, sometimes with no answers. Like the conventional medical would have answers for what you're supposed to. Sometimes in palliative care, the only thing you can do is listen and be there with them and bear witness to the loss and the pain. We have, over the last 2.5 years, we've helped so many caregivers, including nurses and I'll say some doctors, but caregivers of all kinds, in what they went through as the bridge between their dying loved ones. And they're not having, really, because of the epidemic, they weren't even allowed to be.
They could not be with their loved ones.
It was such a torturous route, and she writes about a couple of examples.
Yes.
What a heartbreak it is, and we used to see it. In fact, I have a friend that went through that, and he's in town, and a very nice man. And that's what he went through. There was a glass partition between himself and his wife, and he wasn't allowed to go beyond that partition, and he stayed with it. Stayed at that, and they told her that she needed something, and he ran home to get it. And in that period of time, 20 minutes, she died. And he's grieving. He's doing the best he can. But he talked about how it felt, that he felt that I wish I could have done more, but I couldn't even be at her side when she was dying. And when she said goodbye, when I went away to get something for her, it wasn't a just goodbye until you return. It was her last goodbye. I've heard more stories like this. I've also seen the damage and the pain that caregivers have had to bear because they were the bridge. They were the people that would be communicating between the loved one who was ill and the family. And it's brutal. I've seen more in this last 2 years of caregivers turning away from the professions that they loved and were devoted to.
I think it's leading to some burnout.
A lot, and we are very
repeated experience. Yeah.
Jenny alluded to it. We've developed so many training programs and protocols to intervene for caregivers in our nonprofit, so they don't burn out. Because we've seen so many really dedicated people couldn't take it anymore, to watch so much of death and dying and not being able to do anything, and watch the suffering of the loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen more stories. I've heard more. I have in my own family. I know some where it was unbearable to go through that day and night and see so much suffering and dying,
Yeah.
and the pain of the families, and they're not being able to be there.
Mm-hmm.
It is so unnatural, and it was so devastating. It's caused I would say at this point, it's caused what I would call, and she does it too, a collective grief.
Right.
Even though there's so many different reactions to grief, she's right. I mean, this one thing that we could all look at this point and know that we're sharing in our shared humanity, it is collective grief.
Collective grief.
It's affected everybody.
Everyone's been affected.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and she talks about this, and boy, have we seen it. When you deal with collective grief, it can be very divisive, and people can be almost adversarial with each other, and on different ways of thinking about things and doing things.
How it's supposed to be done.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the way.
There's no right way to grieve.
There isn't.
No.
And what we're learning, and I can speak to, I wasn't always as open-minded, and I'm learning to be, that there's many ways of grieving. But the one thing that we all do share is this overwhelming experience of having to face mortality, and on an enormous scale. And I don't think it's over. I think that the after effects are still going on.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I think and I do believe because of that, it's an opportunity for all of us to be able to come together in some new way. Now, I'm not as much of an idealist as what's her name?
Sunita.
Yeah, she's a beautiful writer. She is an idealist, and honestly, beautiful.
Yeah.
That she feels this is a way that our country can come together.
We could come together instead of being in such
and I do believe it
conflict.
could. Yeah. But our experience so far is that's not what it looks like. In fact, what's happening is so much conflict, and so much that was buried during those times seems now to be bursting through, and it doesn't all pretty. And we've seen so much violence. We've seen conflict. We've seen things that on a pretty big, on a larger scale than we've ever seen before.
Right.
So we know it hasn't brought everybody together yet. We've dealt with other crises, and those times we've seen the facades come down, the self-protection come down, and there was a collective caring for each other and a shared humanity. This
one has felt different.
This one is different. And I remember we used to talk about in the earlier stages that we expected that's what was going to happen here.
And it didn't.
It hasn't happened, not that way.
No.
We hope it will. It's not over. And I hope people will pull together and will even though our reactions may be different to facing all of these things that we're talking about today, that they are there to listen. They're there to hear each other, to share humanity, to take down the barriers of distrust, which has really been emphasized during this pandemic in a major way, and to begin to be more trusting and to be more caring and to be more loving. That is so important because this time we've all been affected. We've all been impacted in different ways. So I do believe Sunita's on the right track. I think she's a beautiful writer. And
I don't think there's any better way for us to kind of close today's episode with what you were just talking about seeing this as a time to come together because we all have lost. We all grieve.
Yes.
And to focus on that instead of on the things that we don't agree with.
Yeah. And we want to reach out to caregivers all over the world through these podcasts and give you encouragement and hope. And we want to emphasize how important it is. We emphasize self-care. Now, we also know how it's so easy when you're dealing with someone so sick or dying or helpless, how easy it is to put our own needs aside. And I know it's strange, but it's a mistake. Because if we don't take care of ourselves and pay attention to our own well-being, we're not going to make it ourselves. And there's going to be burnout. There's going to be an avalanche of health issues that come up. We've seen it. So we want to emphasize to you all, pay attention to our podcasts and the information we have. And we emphasize self-care. And that goes along with the whole package. And if you're going to be in it for the long haul and have the resilience it takes to be there for folks in need, this is a very important issue. So we hope that our podcasts will feed that and fuel that. And any questions you have, any needs, we would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
And please take a look at our YouTube video on our latest on Lynn's legacy, caring for the caregiver. I think it's beautiful. We also have new pins that are coming out that Steve designed.
Yep.
They're actually a picture.
They have Lynn's profile on them.
My wife's profile.
Yeah.
She didn't. It looks like Betty Crocker. She didn't look like Betty Crocker, but
it's just one of those ovals that
it does look a little like that. But
like Betty Crocker. But it's not Betty Crocker.
She was beautiful. Lynn was beautiful, so it's okay.
Yeah,
I don't mind.
so.
It's very pretty, and we hope that you will take what we say seriously, and know that you have someone in your corner that understands, and that's us.
Yes,
and I want to wish you all our best.
Keep bringing you all of the information, the important messages that we want you to have. Just to close off, I got to do my thing. The Survivor's Guide to Life podcast is sponsored by Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment, sctraumatreatment.org. Donations to them will help keep us going here, and we would appreciate it, and they would too. We are the survivorsguidetolife.com. We are on all of the regular podcast outlets, and we have our own YouTube video channel. Please like and share on all of the social media. Peter and I can be reached at 707-781-3335 or Jenny at bernsteininstitute.com. Thank you for joining us.
Keep the faith.
Yeah.